This 1902 portrait of three orphan girls seems ordinary until you notice their matching scar. At first, the photograph looks unremarkable, just another carefully posed image from a charity institution at the start of the century. Three girls in the same dresses, hands folded, faces calm, but one small detail refuses to be ignored. And once you see it, the whole image turns into something very different. Dr. Sarah Brennan had worked as an archivist at the Cincinnati Historical Society for 11 years when she first came across the photograph. It arrived as part of a donated collection from the estate of a wealthy banking family, the Aldridges, stored in a leather portfolio with many other images showing the family's charitable efforts. Sarah was cataloging the collection in the Society's climate-controlled processing room on a Tuesday afternoon in March. When she removed the photograph from its protective sleeve, the image showed three girls, likely between 9 and 12 years old, sitting on a wooden bench inside what looked like a formal parlor. Behind them was floral wallpaper. To their left stood a pot, Ed fern, on a small stand. The girls wore matching white pinafore dresses over dark blouses. Their hair was parted in the center and pulled tightly back from their faces. Their hands rested neatly in their laps. Their expressions were carefully blank, their eyes focused slightly past the camera. It was the kind of institutional portrait meant to comfort donors, showing clean, orderly, grateful chi. Aldrin. Sarah almost set it aside and moved on. She had seen hundreds of similar photographs, orphanages, reform schools, industrial training programs, all those progressive-era institutions that claimed to save poor children, and often ended up consuming them instead. But something made her look again. She tilted the photograph beneath the magnifying lamp on her desk. The girl's posture seemed rigid, even for that time period. Their shoulders were pulled back in a way that suggested discomfort. Their hair, though tidy, looked carefully arranged to hide something. Sarah adjusted her digital scanner to maximum magnification and captured high-resolution images of each girl's neck and upper back. When she studied the images on her monitor, her stomach tightened. Just below the hairline, the back of each girl's neck, barely visible where the hair had shifted during the sitting, was a small crescent-shaped mark. The skin was slightly raised and discolored, a scar, and it was not just on one child. All three had it in the exact same place. This was no longer just an old photograph. Something was wrong. Sarah had spent over a decade studying historical images of vulnerable people. She had catalogued photos of child laborers in factories, portraits of asylum patients, and collections from tuberculosis sanatoriums. She understood how institutions used photography to build stories of progress, reform, and respectability while hiding systems of control beneath the surface. Yet even after thousands of images, this one stopped her. Identical scars on three children in the same institution did not happen by chance. She became careful and precise, guided by years of archival training. She removed the photograph from its mount and examined the backing. In faded brown ink, someone had written, "Girls of the House of Mercy Industrial Training School, Cincinnati, April 1902, photographer Weaver and Son Studio." Below that, in smaller writing, were three names: Ruth, Agnes, Kat. Hareen. No last names, just first names and the institution's name, as if the girls belonged to the House of Mercy rather than to themselves or any family. Sarah photographed the inscription and turned to her computer. She searched Cincinnati city directories from 1900 to 1905. Weaver and Sons operated a studio on Vine Street downtown, specializing in commercial and institutional photography. The IR advertisements stressed discretion and professionalism when working with charities and reform institutions. The House of Mercy Industrial Training School was listed on the west side of the city near the river. The directory described it as a charity for orphaned and wayward girls, founded in 1897 and presented by Mrs. Constance Aldridge, the same family name as the donors. Sarah noted the action and returned the photograph to the lamp. She studied the background more closely, searching for additional clues. The wallpaper looked costly. The fern was a common Victorian decoration meant to soften harsh institutional spaces and make them feel homelike. But something about the composition felt wrong. The girls were positioned with extreme care, as if they had been instructed exactly what your where to place their hands, how to hold their heads, and where to look. Sarah had seen that expression before in photographs of people who were frightened. She leaned back in her chair and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle in. If she stopped now, if she simply catalogued the photograph with a neutral description and moved on, the story would remain hidden. 3 girls with matching scars would stay unnamed, and their suffering would remain unseen. Sarah picked up her phone and texted a colleague at the University of Cincinnati, Dr. Marcus Webb, a historian who specialized in progressive-era child welfare institutions. Found something disturbing. Can you meet tomorrow? The next morning, Marcus arrived carrying a leather satchel and a thermos of coffee. Sarah had placed the photograph on the examination table, along with printouts of her findings. Marcus bent over the image, adjusted his glasses, and remained silent for a long time. "House of Mercy," he said at last. "I know that place." He pulled documents from his satchel and spread them out. The institution was part of a wave of reform schools that opened in the 1890s, claiming to save poor girls from the streets and train them for domestic service, but there had been complaints. He pointed to a newspaper clipping from 1904. Parents tried to reclaim their daughters and were refused. Some girls ran away and reported harsh discipline, but the institution had powerful supporters. The Aldridges, the Tafts, other influential families. The complaints went nowhere. Sarah pointed to the magnified scars on the SC. "Reen. All 3 girls. Same spot. Same shape. That can't be random." Marcus examined the photograph through a magnifying glass. "No," he said slowly. "That's intentional. Some kind of restraint or punishment device that left a consistent mark." He looked up. "We need the institutional records. If the House of Mercy kept logs or medical files, they might explain what happened." They followed OBV, Iowa's leads. The House of Mercy closed in 1911, absorbed into a larger city-run children's home. Sarah requested records from the Hamilton County Archives and found only partial files: admission logs, financial ledgers, donor letters. Daily discipline records and medical files were missing. Either they had been destroyed or kept privately. Sarah searched old Cincinnati newspapers on microfilm. Lou King beyond glowing donor appeals. She found a short article from 1903 about a state inspection. The inspector praised the orderly environment and well-trained inmates, but noted that the institution enforced strict physical discipline in line with modern reformatory science. No details were given. Marcus contacted Dr. Patricia Vance at Johns Hopkins, a medical historian who studied institutional abuse in child welfare settings. When Patricia arrived 3 weeks later, she brought a thick binder of research on disciplinary practices from the era. Restraint collars, Patricia said, spreading photographs and diagrams across the table. They were used in several reform schools at the time. Metal collars lined with leather were placed around the neck, sometimes attached to walls or bedposts. They were sold as humane alternatives to corporal punishment because they left no obvious bruises. Manufacturers called them training devices or posture correction supports. They forced girls to stand or sit in one position for hours, breaking their will without visibly breaking the skin. Sarah felt ill, but they left scars. "Yes," Patricia replied, pointing to a medical diagram from 1906. Low injuries caused pressure sores, nerve damage, and scarring, especially at the back of the neck. The scars were often crescent-shaped because of the collar's design. She looked at the photograph. If these girls have matching scars there, it's almost certain they were subjected to restraint collars. Marcus showed an advertisement from an 1898 trade journal for the Humane Restraint Company of Philadelphia. It depicted a young girl standing stiffly upright, a thin collar around her neck. The text read, "For the correction of wayward and disobedient inmates, encourages proper posture and docile behavior, no lasting harm." "They sold these openly," Sarah said. "They did," Patricia replied. "Progressive reformers believed they were modern and scientific. The language of reform hid many cruelties." Sarah returned to the archives with renewed focus. She needed to know what happened to Ruth, Agnes, and Catherine. She gathered every record related to the House of Mercy. In the financial ledgers, She found payments to the Humane Restraint Company in 1900, 1901, and 1903 listed as corrective equipment. The amounts matched wholesale prices Marcus found in trade catalogues, in donor letters and elegant notes from Constance Aldridge, praising discipline, cleanliness, and obedience. The girls were described as reclaimed and reformed. There was no mention of collars, restraints, or injuries. But in one ledger corner, Sarah noticed a system of symbols beside certain names, small circles, crosses, sometimes both. At first they seemed random, but when compared to infractions and admission, dates, a pattern appeared. Crosses meant posture correction, circles meant confinement for insubordination. Girls marked with both, like Ruth, Agnes, and Catherine, had endured extended corrective discipline. The official story was clean, progressive, and kind. The photographs showed neat children in orderly rooms, but beneath it were payments for restraint devices, coded punishments, and girls posed with matching scars hidden beneath their hair. Sarah knew she had to go further. She needed to understand the full scope of what happened at the House of Mercy and how it fit into larger systems that controlled children labeled as troublesome. She drove to the west side of Cincinnati where the institution once stood. The building was gone, replaced by a small park and community center. Still, the place carried echoes. Sarah walked the area with Marcus and Patricia, using old maps and photographs. The House of Mercy had been a 3-story brick building with barred upper windows. The girls slept in third-floor dormitories, worked in laundry and sewing rooms on the second floor, and studied in ground-floor classrooms. The parlor where the photo was taken sat at the front, dead to impress visitors. At the Hamilton County Courthouse, Sarah requested legal files connected to the institution. In a box of unsorted papers from the early 1900s, she found a complaint from 1904. A woman named Margaret O'Connor sought custody of her 13-year-old daughter Catherine, placed at the House of Mercy after her father died, and the family fell into poverty. The complaint bed Catherine when Margaret finally saw her after 8 months. Thin, frightened, and marked around the neck with injuries she would not explain. The court denied the request, ruling Catherine was receiving proper care, and that Margaret, an unwed mother without resources, was unfit. Catherine remained at the House of Mercy for 3 more years. Patricia helped Sarah place the case in a broader company. End text. Reform schools and industrial training institutions operated in a grey space between charity and imprisonment. They received public money and private donations, yet answered to no one. Parents, especially poor parents, had very little legal power to question institutional decisions. Girls were committed for unclear reasons, like stubborn behavior or being labeled a moral risk. Once inside, they had no one to defend them. The institutions claimed they were fixing the girls, but in reality, they trained them for lives of servitude, crushing their spirits with discipline that would have been called torture if used on animals. The restraint collar was only one of many tools. There were isolation rooms, cold water punishments, forced labor, and near-starvation diets. But the collar was especially cruel because it kept girls fully awake and aware, unable to move, sometimes for 8 or 10 hours at a time. It was designed to teach obedience through exhaustion and pain, turning the body itself into a tool of submission. Sarah found a written account from a former inmate of a similar institution in New York, recorded in a 1908 social work report. The woman, who had been confined as a girl in 1902, described her experience. They put the collar on at night if you talked back or refused to work. You were made to stand in the hallway with your neck fixed to the wall, unable to sit or lie down. By morning, your arms were numb and the skin at the back of your neck was raw. They told us it was for our own good to teach proper behavior. The photograph Sarah discovered was taken April 1902, likely shortly after Ruth, Agnes, and Catherine had endured this punishment. Their scars were still fresh enough to be seen, despite attempts to hide them with carefully styled hair. The image was meant for the institution's annual report to donors, meant to prove that reform was working. Look at these well-behaved girls, it seemed to say. See how clean, calm, and grateful they are. Your money has changed them from troublesome children into respectable future servants. But the scars told another story. They showed the violence needed to create that image of obedience. They marked the girls as survivors of a system that used kind words like mercy to excuse cruelty. Sarah knew what came next would be hard. She now had the proof and the context. But bringing this truth into public view meant challenging the descendants of the institution's founders and a local historical culture that had spent over a century telling a softened version of progressive-era reform. She prepared a formal presentation for the Cincinnati Historical Society's Collections Committee, scheduled for a Tuesday evening in October. The group included board members, major donors, and community leaders. Sarah knew that some of them were descendants of people who had supported the House of Mercy. The Aldridge family still had 2 members on the board. Sarah set up her materials in the conference room. She projected the photograph of the 3 girls, then moved to the enlarged images showing the scars. She displayed financial records showing payments for restraint equipment, legal complaints fro. Parents trying to get their daughters back, and testimonies from survivors of similar institutions. She built the case carefully, step by step. When she finished, the room stayed silent for a long time. Then Thomas Aldridge, a retired banker in his 70s, cleared his throat. He said this was a very serious accusation. His great-grandmother, Constance Aldridge, had founded the House of Mercy. Out of real concern for vulnerable girls, she was a progressive reformer ahead of her time. To suggest she ran an institution that tortured children was, in his words, offensive. Sarah kept her voice calm. She said she was not making accusations, only presenting documented evidence. The restraint equipment purchases were in the records. The scars were visible in the photograph. The legal comply. NTAs were real. This is what happened. Margaret Voss, the board president, leaned forward and said they needed to consider historical context. Progressive-era reformers believed they were helping children. These methods might seem harsh now, but at the time they were considered scientific. She argued that the past should not be judged by modern standards. Sarah replied that she was not judging in tensions. She was stating facts. Ruth, Agnes, and Catherine were subjected to painful restraints that left permanent scars. The photograph was staged to hide that harm and raise more money. Those were facts, not opinions. Patricia spoke from the back of the room. She explained that she had studied many such institutions. The abuse was not accidental. It was organized and repeated. Not all reform used these methods. Even at the time, people debated whether restraint devices were ethical. Those who used them knew they caused harm, but the victims were poor children with no power. Thomas Aldridge shook his head and said this would damage the society's reputation. Donors remembered the House of Mercy as a good institution. Their families had supported it for years. If the society labeled it abusive, donations would disappear. Then we lose them. Sarah said, "We don't hide the truth to protect donors. These girls deserve an honest story." The meeting lasted another 2 hours. People argued about wording, balance, and whether the evidence was truly conclusive. Some members were deeply troubled by the findings and wanted the truth told clearly. Others worried about controversy, money, and damaging respected family names. Margaret Voss kept reminding everyone that the Society's mission was to preserve and present history honestly, even when it was uncomfortable. In the end, the committee narrowly approved an exhibition centered on the photograph and the wider story of institutional abuse during the progressive era. There were conditions. The exhibit had to include multiple viewpoints. It had to acknowledge reformers' stated intentions along with the documented harm. It had to be educational, not openly accusatory. Sarah agreed, though she knew she would have, to fight against the story being softened into something meaningless. Over the next months, Sarah and Marcus worked with designers and educators to create the exhibition. They titled it Hidden in Plain Sight: Photography and Power in Progressive-Era Reform. The photograph of Ruth, Agnes, and Catherine was the centerpiece, displayed large, with magnified images of the scars beside it. Nearby were financial records, legal complaints, survivor testimonies, and explanations of restraint collars and other punishments. They also wanted to focus on the girls as people, not just symbols. Sarah spent weeks tracing what happened to them after they left the House of Mercy. Ruth appeared in the 1910 census as a domestic servant in a home on Cincinnati's east side. She was listed as 20 years old. With no family, living in the servants' quarters, Sarah could find nothing more about her. Agnes appeared in records from a tuberculosis sanatorium in 1908. She died there in 1909 at age 18. Her death certificate listed her occupation as domestic and noted that there was no family to notify. Catherine's story was different. Sarah found her in the records of a small African Methodist Episcopal church on the west side, the same church that had tried to help her mother regain custody. Though the court had denied Margaret O'Connor's petition, the church had not given up. In 1907, when Catherine turned 16 and aged out of the institution, church members met her at the door of the House of Mercy and brought her home to her mother. Church records showed Catherine married in 1912, had 3 children, and lived until 1956. Sarah contacted Catherine's granddaughter, Denise Williams, who still lived in Cincinnati. Denise had heard vague stories about her grandmother's time in the institution, always described as something painful best left unspoken. When Sarah showed her the photograph and explained the scars, Denise cried. She said her grandmother never spoke directly about it, but she remembered her rubbing the back of her neck, especially when stressed. She was always gentle, never harsh with children. She used to say that children need love, not breaking. Denise agreed to contribute her family's story to the exhibition and highlighted how the church community had helped Catherine survive and rebuild her life. The exhibition opened in March 2023, more than a year after Sarah first found the photograph. The response was strong. Local media covered it widely. Some praised the society for facing hard truths. Others accused it of damaging the reputation of progressive reformers. The Aldridge family released a statement expressing regret for any harm done while defending their ancestors' intentions. The most powerful reactions came from visitors who recognized their own family histories in the display. Descendants of girls confined in similar institutions left notes thanking the society for finally acknowledging what had happened. One woman wrote that her grandmother had been in a similar place in Kentucky and had the same scar. She said she never knew what it meant until now. A few weeks after opening, Sarah stood in the exhibition space watching visitors move through. College students gathered around the photograph reading carefully. A middle-aged couple studied the financial records in silence. A grandmother explained restraint collars to her grandchildren and why they were wrong. Marcus joined Sarah and told her she had done good work. Sarah nodded, feeling the familiar heaviness of this kind of research. 3 girls, she said. 2 died. One was saved by a community that refused to give up, and for 100 years this photograph sat quietly as proof of successful charity. Not anymore, Marcus said. The exhibition ran for 6 months and later traveled to 2 other cities, sparking similar conversations about reform institutions, abuse, and the power of photography to create false stories. Sarah published an article in a historical journal that became a starting point for more research into disciplinary practices in child welfare institutions. But what stayed with her most was simpler. She had given Ruth, Agnes, and Catherine their names back. She had shown what the photograph tried to hide. She insisted that the scars mattered, that they showed real pain inflicted on real children in the name of mercy. Old photographs are not neutral. They are created, staged, and framed to tell specific stories for specific purposes. The portrait of 3 girls in matching dresses sitting neatly in a parlor was meant to reassure wealthy donors that their money was turning poor and wayward children into respectable servants. It was propaganda designed to hide the violence behind that appearance of order. But sometimes photographs accidentally preserve evidence that challenges their message. A strand of hair moves, a child's expression slips. And if you are willing to look closely, the image reveals what it was meant to conceal. There are thousands of such photographs in archives and family albums across the country. Images of orphanages and reform schools showing clean children in neat rooms, all claiming success. How many hide matching scars, coded records, stories of restraint and pain? How many girls like Ruth, AGN, and Catherine remain frozen in those images, their suffering buried under careful poses and polite captions? Looking again at these photographs is not about blaming the past. It is about restoring truth and dignity to people who had neither when the camera clicked. It is about saying their pain mattered, their resistance mattered, their survival mattered. The photograph of Ruth, Agnes, and C. Athryn now hangs in the Cincinnati Historical Society's permanent collection, shown with full context about the House of Mercy and what the scars represent. Visitors can finally see the girls not as symbols of charity, but as children who endured institutional abuse, and whose story deserves honesty. Catherine survived, built a family, and passed on a legacy of gentleness that her granddaughter still honors. Ruth and Agnes faded from the record, their lives cut short. But they are no longer invisible. Every photograph of institutional life from this era deserves the same careful attention, the same willingness to look beneath respectability, because the truth is always in the details, in hand, folded too tightly, in eyes that look past the camera, and in the small crescent scars hidden just below the hairline, quietly proving the violence the image was meant to hide.